Welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Amanda Sardonis with the Environment and Natural Resources Program at the Belfer Center, one of the co-sponsors of the Energy Policy Seminar, along with the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government and the Harvard University Center for the Environment. I'm going to open with just a few reminders about the logistics of our virtual seminar today. We're recording the session and we'll post it on our website. And there you'll find registration links for future seminars, including next week's session, Space-Based Solar Geoengineering and Astropolitics. And that will be a hybrid event with lunch provided. This is the first time in 2 years. Very exciting. And when you register for that event, you can indicate if you'll be attending in person or virtually. Today, we have Professors Henry Lee and Dan Schrag, who will share insights from their new book, Foundations for a Low Carbon Energy System in China. And we've enlisted our postdoctoral research fellow, Priyank Lothwal, as our moderator. We'll take questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. So you can click on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and submit your question anytime during the seminar presentations. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Priyank. He is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Belfer Center. He holds a PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University, where his research focused on decarbonizing freight transportation, and he was supported by the National Science Foundation. He also has a master's in management science and engineering from Columbia University, where he was an international fellow at the School of International and Public Affairs. His current research focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from energy use while exploring the climate and environmental justice issues, particularly in the United States, China, and India. And when you're on our website, checking out the next session of the Energy Policy Seminar, you can also see the video recording of Priyank's seminar that he did for us last semester. So Priyank, over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. So I'm going to introduce our speakers today, Daniel Schrag and Henry Lee. Dan Schrag is the Sturgis Hooper Professor of Geology, a Professor of Environmental Science and Engineering at Harvard University, and Director of the Harvard University Center for the Environment. He also co-directs the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Henry Lee is the Jessim M. Jaida Family Director of the Environment and Natural Resources program within the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also the faculty co-chair of the HKS Arctic Initiative and Decarbonization in China Research Project, as well as is a senior lecturer in public policy. Dan and Henry, thank you very much for being here with us. With that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Priyank. Thank you, Amanda. It's great to have the opportunity to talk to you about this project that Henry and I worked on together with a team of wonderful colleagues, postdocs, scholars, wonderful people, and it's nice to see it finally bear fruit. I'm going to start out with a few comments about the framing of the book, also sort of try to introduce for this audience a little bit of an explanation of why decarbonization in China is fundamentally more difficult than it is in the US. It's difficult everywhere, but it's particularly difficult in China, and what the energy system in China looks like a little bit. And then I'm going to pass it off to Henry, who will go into a little bit more detail on a couple of aspects from chapters in the book. So I'm going to share some slides, and then hopefully at the end of this, and after Henry's spoken, we'll have a chance to take some questions from the audience. So here is a copy, here is the cover of the book. It's actually not that thick a book. It sells on Amazon for an obscene amount of money. And so, so much for publishing with university presses. I think they make their money off of selling these books to libraries. So it's very hard for me with a straight face to encourage people to actually buy a copy. But let me tell you a little bit about the history of this. Henry and I, for many years, have been working on energy systems in China and the question of decarbonization. And several years ago, we happened to have in residence an extraordinary group of fellows. Wang Pu, really one of the great young thinkers from China. He's now at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. but he thinks about Chinese electricity policy, really a brilliant young scholar. Wei Peng, she got her PhD from Princeton and is now a professor at Penn State University. Michael Davidson, who had come from MIT and is now a professor at UCSD in San Diego. And then Mao Jimin, who's now at the World Bank. We were meeting with these fellows regularly, and Henry and I decided to, because all of their capabilities were so great, we decided to actually bring everybody together. And rather than each person working completely autonomously on their own projects, we decided to try to put everybody's minds together and write this book, where the chapters would cover various components of what we call the foundations for a low carbon energy system in China. And let me just say a few words about what that goal is. By the way, I should add that we strong-armed our colleague Matt Bunn, an expert on nuclear energy and nuclear security, to write a chapter about nuclear energy in China, because it was a critical piece, and we thank Matt for playing that role. So deep decarbonization in China, essentially now China has created a goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2060. When we actually started writing this book, and in fact, even when we finished this book, China had yet to make those commitments. So we had to actually add that in the revision stage of this book. But in some ways, policy has caught up with us, and this book is even more relevant today than it was when we wrote it, because of now this tangible long-term commitment that China has made towards zero emissions. The problem is that figuring out exactly how China is going to get to net zero is an incredibly difficult thing, because we don't know what technology is going to be available, and we don't know what technology is going to cost. So many of those things have changed in the last 15 years that we have to anticipate that over the next nearly 40 years out to 2060, the changes will be even more significant. And so the goal of this book was not to try to make a prediction or set out scenarios for a low carbon energy system in China, but rather to ask the question, what are the fundamental policy changes? What are the policy conditions that will make it easier for China to achieve deep decarbonization in the future, but things that would be useful and essentially critical for them to do right now? So this is not trying to predict the distant future. This book is really about what are the current changes in policy that are needed to make this path towards net zero more feasible. It's really about short-term policy goals for long-term policy objectives. So this is back now a long time ago, 8 years ago, November 2014, President Obama met with President Xi, and they created a bilateral climate agreement that in many ways was the foundation for the Paris Agreement that followed a year later. US projected an economy-wide target of reducing its emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 by 2025, and to try to make its best efforts to be on the high end of that range. Of course, that has been dramatically increased by President Biden, who now would like to see 50% by 2030. That sounds pretty aggressive, but we'll see. China, meanwhile, made a commitment to achieve the peaking of CO2 emissions around 2030 and to make best efforts to peak early and to increase the share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy consumption to around 20% by 2030. At the time this was done, this was a huge deal. As I said, this was in some ways the foundation for the Paris Agreement. It was a very important step in global progress on mitigating climate change. And I would argue, and I still think it's true today, even after 4 years of Trump's disengagement on this issue, that the US-China relationship, both cooperation and competition, will be absolutely critical to achieving deeper levels of carbon emissions reductions in the future. Of course, complicated by all of the different ways that China and the US are rivals, including what's happening with Russia in the Ukraine right now, and China's support for Russia. So all of that gets things much more complicated, but I still believe this US-China relationship on energy systems is going to be absolutely critical. let's talk about some of the good news about why this is actually exciting. China is building wind and solar like crazy. Here are solar panels installed across southern China. The scale of what they've done is absolutely incredible. You can see here, this shows renewable capacity in China in gigawatts. And you can see that as of 2021, they were over 1,000 gigawatts of installed capacity, roughly split evenly between wind, solar, and hydro. Just to put this in perspective, and this is a slide showing capacity for 2020. The numbers for China are a little bit different, but within error, they're the same. You see, compared to all of the other countries in the world, China just blows everyone away in terms of the scale of renewable energy capacity. And they've built this relatively quickly over the last decade. But before you get too excited about that progress, if you step back and look at their total energy consumption, you can see that the other renewable sources, that is wind and solar, separate from hydro, are only about 5% in 2019. Still, coal is their dominant, with oil a distant second. Coal still accounts for nearly 60% of their primary energy consumption. So just to give you a quick review, China's oil consumption has been growing like crazy as their GDP has grown. They are now by far the largest oil importer in the world, importing over 10 million barrels of oil a day, dwarfed only by the whole EU, which imports about 14 million barrels a day. You can see where they get their oil. They get it from all over the world, but about 15% does come from Russia. And that is, of course, a critical aspect of geopolitics today with the situation in Ukraine. I'm going to skip this very quickly, but since 2008, they've started to import a lot of natural gas, mostly from LNG, a little bit from pipelines. But it's still a small fraction. It's about a third of the total natural gas consumption of the US. It's still relatively minor in their overall energy mix. Of course, coal is the big story, and they do import coal as well. You could see for the last 10 years or so, consumption has exceeded production, and so they are net importing. But they're ultimately, if they're going to reach their goals, they're going to have to stop using coal. A fundamental difference in the Chinese energy system is that coal is not just used for electricity. This shows net electricity generation by fuel type. And you can see that while growth of solar and wind have been so extraordinary and leading the world, on this graph of total electricity generation, you can see that solar and wind are really, you have to squint to make them out. They're still pretty tiny. Coal is totally dominant, with hydro, of course, being extremely important overall, not in terms of capacity, because obviously solar and wind have high capacity, but low total generation because their capacity factors are low. So China's electricity system is totally dominated by coal, but in the US, over 90% of coal use is for electricity. In China, that number is closer to 50%. And that's a really fundamental difference. Here is a quick graph just showing where coal consumption goes by sector. You can see, yes, a little over half for power generation, but chemicals, construction materials and manufacturing, and steelmaking, direct use of coal, is enormous in China. And so that is a fundamentally different energy system than the US, and it means different things. So we step out, this is, again, their total energy consumption in China. And this is from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. So they've made a lot of progress, yes, but solar and wind are still really small. The purple field and the light sort of chartreuse field at the very top of the figure. They're growing fast. It's really exciting, but we're a long way from being significant. Ultimately, decarbonization is going to have to address reducing oil and coal consumption. And that's really where the challenge comes in. So stabilizing emissions by 2030 for China is going to be much easier than even starting down the path towards net zero by 2060. And the reason for that is very simple. If they reduce their coal use in their industrial sector simply because they're building fewer buildings, they're building fewer roads, they're building fewer airports and infrastructure because their economic growth is slowing down, they will probably be able to stabilize emissions even if they increase emissions in other sectors. So their economic transition towards a slower growing economy is likely to lead to stabilizing emissions. But reducing emissions ultimately requires cutting their use of coal. And that is going to be really hard. Yes, wind and solar are growing. They're trying to invest in nuclear power as well, but it's not even keeping up with the growth of the coal industry, much less an actual decline in coal consumption. So there are critical areas here. They're going to have to learn how to manage the intermittency of renewable sources like solar and wind. How they can do it without a substantial increase in natural gas is a big question. In the US and Europe, we use natural gas to back up wind and solar. Using coal to do that in China is pretty complicated. Electrification of passenger vehicles. This is a phase where Europe and the US are going full speed ahead, and we have reduced the carbon intensity of our power sector, especially in Europe, enough so this actually reduces emissions. But in China, because their coal emissions dominate their vehicle sector, it has the potential at least to increase near-term emissions. So it's a little bit more complicated. Nuclear power, this is where Matt Bunn made a very important contribution to this volume. It's not, sorry, an extra zero there. Displacement of coal be limited before 2050, not 20,500. That's a little more skeptical than even I would be, or even Matt would be. But nuclear may play a role in the distant future, but the ability to build massive amounts of nuclear before 2050 looks extremely limited. So nuclear may play a role in the long run, but their bigger challenges are about nuclear safety in the near term. And that's the main thrust of Matt's thesis in his chapter. I think the important thing that we reach in this book is that this important point is that progress in all these areas requires significant investments in research and experimentation. We think cooperation will be critical, but getting electricity policy right is absolutely essential. China needs to fix its policies for all sorts of things, from siting, transmission, and generation to pricing electricity. They've been dominated by state-run industries that have had monopolies and have made decisions based on the existing powers, which is mostly the coal industry. And if you really want to achieve decarbonization and do it in an economically efficient way, you have to change the way electricity is priced. You have to get the incentives right to kind of use the market to compete. Unfortunately, that's not President Xi's approach. He doesn't show any sign of embracing these changes, but market reforms in the power sector in China to us is the most essential step for laying the foundation to deep decarbonization in China. It will be critical ultimately to achieve its goals. I'm going to stop there and pass this off to Henry, who will go into a little bit more detail, but I hope I've given you a flavor for how we think about these problems. Henry, go ahead.
Thank you. And Paul has agreed to help me with sharing my slides. Let me start by summarizing very quickly in a sort of 20 seconds what our main theme of the book was, or is. Next slide, please. To meet its 2060 targets, China will have to electrify most of its energy system, a system that is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, as Dan mentioned. And it must transition that electricity system to non-fossil fuel use, i.e. get off coal. And finally, to accomplish this transition, China must reform its institutions and rely more on markets than it has been comfortable doing heretofore. When we did each of our chapters, whether it was on air pollution or transportation or electricity or coal, we all came to the same, every chapter came to the same conclusion, which is these three items. Next item, next slide, please. Electricity reform is going to be critical. So China aims to have 80% of its energy from non-fossil fuel sources by 2060. And to meet its 2030 goal, which is just changed in the new 5-year plan, it wants to triple its wind and solar capacity, not just its renewable, to meet 20% of its energy from renewables, but to meet a figure of 1,200 gigawatts of wind and solar in the next 8 years. If China successfully converts its vehicle fleet to electricity, it's going to need a capacity to power approximately 350 million vehicles. And I think that number is probably low. So the magnitude of what their task ahead of them is huge. About 70% of China's energy is consumed by industry, and much of this energy needed for these industry is going to have to convert from coal and other fossil fuels again to electricity. So the conversion to electrify the Chinese economy is just a huge undertaking. In summarize, China is going to need to electrify almost its entire system. Next slide, please. Now, China's energy structure, I think, is important to understand. It's dominated by large state-owned companies with extraordinary market power. There are 2 electric companies, 2 grids, state grid in the north and southern grid in the south, and they wholesale, they transmit, they distribute all of China's power. The only other part of the system is the generation, where there is some competition. There are still very large state-owned enterprises, both centrally owned by the Beijing government and provincially owned, that generate a fair amount of power. But the wholesaling, transmission, and distribution is all done by 2 companies that are monopolies, one in the northern and central part of China and one in the south. These 2 companies also manage the Chinese grid. 3 companies dominate the production, refining, and distribution of oil. And the financing is supplied by state-owned banks. Hence, supply and demand are heavily influenced by government. When I'm asked to give predictions on what China will use in terms of oil and gas, and what the demand will be and what the supply will be, 10 years out, you can't look at markets in China. You have to make projections or predictions about what the government is likely to do. And that is a very inexact science. Next slide, please. One of the themes of our book was the need to accelerate the greater use of markets. Now, this is something that China has never been very comfortable with in the energy area because of their concern over energy security. But China has to make significant reforms if it's going to be able to electrify its system. And I'm going to talk about 3 here for just a minute, and I'm going to dive a little deeper than I have on the previous items. The first is that China has a dispatch system that was very relevant to its need for additional power in the 1990s and the first decade of this century. And this is called the equal share protocol, in which each generator negotiates with the government, and the government says that we will buy or we will take a certain percent of your power. We guarantee it. So we guarantee your revenue stream. This in turn gave comfort to investors to make the investments in new generation that was so essential for China to proceed with its dramatic economic growth over the first 20 years between 1990 and 2010. That system does not work very well if you're trying to move towards a decarbonized world, more reliant on intermittent energy. And so the protocol that we use in the West is something that is a protocol based on least cost of power. Least cost of power means is that the cheapest plant to operate goes online first, then the next cheapest, then the next cheapest. Now, there are some constraints around security of the system and transmission availability, but by and large, it runs on the principle of marginal economic cost of the next plant to be put on. If you change the Chinese system tomorrow from equal shares protocol to one more reliant on least cost of power, probably within about 8 years, you would retire about 40% of the inefficient facilities that China now uses. So this could have a dramatic impact on the Chinese system. Second, it must cap the carbon emissions in its existing cap and trade program. As you know, China has initiated a cap and trade program, not a really cap program, basically a trading program on emissions. For one sector only, which is the electric utility sector. Now, it is responsible for approximately 40% of China's carbon emissions. And so, but it has refused up to now to put a cap on it. And therefore, it really is a performance standard. It is really not a trading program. There's a lot of debate in China about putting a cap, and I think that they may move towards this, but it is essential if you're going to have a price on carbon to have a cap on carbon emissions, even if the only sector you're looking at is the electricity sector. There is also discussion of expanding the trading program to other sectors, but China is at least 2 years away from doing that at the moment. Third, it must develop flexible retail tariffs. Right now, the tariff system is such that the tariffs are set and they hold for about 5 years. The process of setting the tariffs is very opaque, and the tariffs are in many cases below costs. In a world in which you're going to have to think about how you're going to manipulate demand, this is a big problem. And at least as you're looking at the industrial sector, China needs to move to more flexible tariffs and greater use of advanced metering in order to provide incentives for the industrial sector to begin to reduce its demand and also to move the peak demand or to at least broaden it so that you have more flexibility in the system. And the last item is they need to think about the provincial barriers to electricity trade. Now, what this means is that if you have one province that has a lot of inexpensive renewable energy, a neighboring province has fairly inefficient and expensive fossil fuel facilities. Many of those fossil fuel facilities are owned by provincial state-owned companies that provide revenue to that province. So the province is reluctant to buy the cheaper and more available renewable power from its neighbor because it will affect the revenue flow to its treasury. So a lot of the curtailment problem is because of these provincial barriers to trade. The Beijing government has been trying to get these removed for many years, and it has had great difficulty in doing this. But it is essential if you're going to have reforms to, one, go to more of a cost of power or least cost of power protocol for dispatch, two, to remove the provincial barriers to trade, and three, to put a price on carbon by putting a cap on the trading program, and four, by moving to more flexible tariffs. Next slide. A few words about transportation and electric vehicles. China is the leading country in selling electric cars. In 2021, they sold 1.6 million electric passenger cars, or 8% of car sales. Its goal is to sell 5.5 million, or 20% of the sales in 2030. I think they're well on their way to meet that goal. The government is beginning to move away from heavy reliance on subsidies, which they've had since about 2012. Those subsidies were supposed to come off the books last year and this year. They've been extended partially for another 2 years because of the COVID problem. But China intends to rely heavily on what I term EV portfolio standards, which means that each car company has to sell a proportion of their fleet has to be electric. So they can trade allowances in the same way we can trade for electricity. But the key here is that every car company, through regulation, is now producing a portion of its fleet is electric vehicles, and that proportion is going to grow over time. The second is that they are using regulatory systems to push people to buy EVs. For example, if you want to get you want to register your new car in many Chinese cities, you have to go into a lottery. The chances of you winning the lottery is about 1 in 200. Your chances of winning the lottery if you have an electric car is 100%. You don't even have to go into it. And and there are others that are similar types of regulatory rules that are pushing Chinese consumers to buy electric cars. China is also building out its charging infrastructure. It has third-party charging companies are installing stations, particularly around the outer parts of a lot of the Chinese cities. China is giving generous subsidies, and they are putting out new rules and regulations about installing charging units in the garages and in all new buildings. And finally, China is now the largest battery producer in the world. CATL is the largest company, producer of batteries, is now producing more batteries than Panasonic or Samsung. Interestingly, it tripled its output from 2020 to 2021, which is really incredible given it was in the middle of the pandemic. Next slide, please. China has, next slide. Well, let me, as we move towards the next slide, let me just summarize it, is that Dan pointed out correctly that if you accelerate the penetration of EVs, particularly in northern China, you're going to increase carbon emissions due to the dominance of coal in the generation of power. In the south, you've got a little more flexibility because a lot of the power in the south is from hydropower, and therefore most of the studies show that it's sort of a wash. Yes, you will be some increase in emissions, but you'll have decrease in emissions because of the electric vehicles. But in the north, that is not the case. Despite this fact, we argued in the book that this should not deter the Chinese from pushing the transition to electric cars, since the benefits in establishing consumer confidence and building out the infrastructure outweigh the costs of the incremental emissions that you will have in the short term. Over time, China will be converting its coal electric utility generation to renewables, and at that point, the emissions will be significantly lower. But in the short term, the next 15 years or so, emissions may very well go up in the north because of EVs, but the trade-off, we believe, is well worth making. Last slide, please. This is not really in our book, but because this is such a dominant issue right now in China, I thought I would say a few words about energy security. First, the primary driver of China's energy policy remains energy security. In the last few months, China was faced with several major security crises. The first was in September, they had major and prolonged blackouts in 18 provinces caused by a shortage of coal and very high coal prices, which incentivized generators and manufacturing companies to reduce their purchase of coal, and in some cases to simply shut down or slow down. As a result, it was both an economic crisis and a fuel crisis and a crisis in terms of electricity. By about late October, China sort of moved on, but it really focused the country on the whole problem of energy security again. Today, about maybe 40% of China's imported natural gas is in the form of LNG, and the prices for LNG are about 6 times those in the United States for natural gas. So gas prices right now in China are at new highs, and China is trying to allocate that gas to the residential sector as much as possible. And this is creating, again, problems with the industrial sector's inability to either afford the gas or in some cases to even be able to find the gas. Finally, oil prices have hovered over $100, and China is having the same kind of problems that every other country in the world is having with high oil prices and high gasoline prices. And as Dan pointed out, Russia is China's second largest source of imports behind Saudi Arabia. Now, China has taken a number of actions to deal with this problem, and among them has been a directive to slow down their carbon emission targets and focus on increasing supplies and controlling energy costs in the near term. Now, I would argue that this is a short or midterm movement away from the emphasis on climate. I think they'll come back to it, but it is a very significant set of actions or focuses that are now going on in China. And I think that China will, at least for now, put energy security slightly over climate in terms of significance, simply because it has a dramatic effect on its economy and its long-term security. With that, we're open to questions, and I realize that I've covered a lot very quickly, but I hope I've stimulated a lot of thought about these different issues.
Thanks, Dan and Henry, for really informative and excellent presentations. I guess one of the first questions I have is that, given the findings of your work in China, what are the broad takeaways for policymakers and countries that are locked in fossil fuel dominated energy systems and are looking to transition to low carbon economies in the coming decades? And it's open for both. So
I think there are some universal lessons here. Obviously, every country is a little bit different. And as I explained, the Chinese energy system doesn't have the benefit of natural gas that has been, I think people need to appreciate that in the US and in Europe, a substantial fraction of the total decarbonization has been a swap over the last many decades of, in the US more recently, from coal to gas. And that has contributed substantially to carbon reduction. Europe is now pushing renewables a lot faster in terms of percentage of generation than either the US or China. Most of Europe, you're well above 20%, and in some cases like Spain and Germany and Ireland, you're above 40%, whereas in the US, we're around 13 or 14%. China is around a little bit behind us, maybe 11 or 12% total electricity generation. So both the US and China have a long way to go to catch up to China. But I think the general conclusions we make about setting the market conditions right for this energy transition will ultimately be cost effective for every country. Whether you're talking about India, where there are big subsidies for the fossil fuel sector to reduce prices that consumers pay. That's true in Indonesia as well. It's true in South Africa. It really is universal, Priyank, because as you know, fossil fuels still make up over 80% of our energy system around the world. So just about everywhere, with a few exceptions like Costa Rica and Iceland and Kenya, just about everywhere is dominated by fossil fuels. Henry?
Yeah, I would say 3 things. The first is that institutions matter, and we discussed some of these. The second is incentives matter. Right now, the incentives are still slightly biased toward building coal facilities in China, and those have to change. And the third is flexibility matters in a transition to a low carbon world. When China faced its supply problems in 1990, it made a lot of sense to use what the team at Oxford, who has been doing studies on China and carbon or climate, they term sort of hard power or hard electricity. This is state-owned enterprises, building large infrastructure projects, building power plants, building large transmission lines. When you're going to a transition to a source of electricity that is very intermittent, you're going to have to deal with the intermittency problem. You're going to have to deal with time of use issues in terms of consumption. You're going to have to look at demand side management. You're going to have to look at a lot of these softer items in which are harder to achieve by large state enterprises. And you're going to need more decentralized decisions made by thousands and thousands of officials and hundreds of people, of millions of people who choose what appliances to buy, what cars to buy. All of these decisions are going to have to be made by a different set of people than simply a few people as head of large state enterprises. So China is going to have to move more towards what I call, what the Oxford crew calls soft electricity or soft energy. And that means it's going to have to go more towards market incentives. And to a large extent, China has started down that road. Last year, 40% of its power was sold through markets. When you go back 5 or 6 years ago, only about 5% was sold through those markets. So they are moving, but they have a lot further to go. So it's incentives, institutions, and flexibility.
Great. So this next question is on what's the role of CCS in China's decarbonization journey? And do you think nuclear is going to remain a small share of energy production in China in the coming decades?
So those are two really important questions. Let's take the slightly easier one first because it's directly addressed in the book, which is Matt Bunn's arguments about nuclear, which I think are essentially correct. And the answer is yes, it will remain a small fraction of the overall energy mix because the rate at which China can build nuclear power plants compared to the scale of what we're talking about, you know, we're talking about if China's really successful, they might be able to build 100 gigawatts of nuclear power in the next couple of decades. That would be extraordinary. And there's a lot of signs that their nuclear program is not on track to do that. But even if they did, it would still be a drop in the bucket compared to more than 1,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants. So the reality is, on the time scale of the next 20-ish years, or even 30 years, nuclear is going to remain a small but important source of power for China. The question is, beyond 2050, you know, as the challenges of intermittency continue, what role will nuclear play? And there, I think it's much more uncertain. I think Matt's argument was that the investments in policy towards safety, making sure there's no accidents, will be as critical as anything else to allowing the option of nuclear power in the future, depending on cost and capabilities. And I think that's right, ultimately. If China has a big nuclear accident, nuclear will go off the list. And that, and therefore, one of the critical things, if you want to even preserve the option of nuclear power in the future, you need to make sure that the policies are in place to do it safely. On CCS in China 20 years ago seemed like an obvious step because of their dominance of coal-fired power plants. Of course, most of their coal-fired power plants would be difficult to retrofit. And so the question is that how likely is that? I tend to think that it's a possibility, but it has a big structural problem, which is that carbon capture and storage on an existing coal plant or even a new coal plant is fundamentally more expensive than not doing it. Whereas wind and solar have gotten very, very cheap, so they can be disruptive. So you actually have a technology that outcompetes new coal-fired power plants. CCS is never going to outcompete a coal-fired power plant that doesn't have CCS. And so I think that may still happen. It may be really important for their industrial use of coal, but I think I don't think it's going to be a first line of attack in the power sector. I could be wrong, but that's my suspicion. Henry, maybe you disagree.
No, I have nothing to add. I think it was a great answer.
Great. So what is the assumption behind the statement that China must use a market-based system to decarbonize? Evidence suggests that market-based instruments have primarily favored deployment and incremental improvements in mature technologies, while providing lesser certainty and stability needed for investments in capital intensive and less mature infrastructure like renewable energy. In contrast, a lot of investments have been mobilized and novel technologies have been pushed down their learning curve by strong state planning and interventions. Shouldn't there be a differentiated approach for less and more mature technologies/systems?
So that's a good question. I think I would disagree with some of the assertions there that were just made. I agree that China has been incredibly successful in what you might call buying down the learning curve. To be fair, I'm not sure China gets the full credit. Their manufacturing kind of created the learning curve. They did the learning, but Germany gets a lot of credit for starting that pathway and creating markets. And so do many other countries, including the US and India, who we all buy Chinese photovoltaic devices. But no question, China's investment in renewable, its strong central decisions to build out renewables, especially in the northwestern part of the country, have certainly contributed to the global learning curve on wind and solar. But I think we're entering a different phase for wind and solar. As I said, some countries in Europe are around 40% of their electricity generation, and getting higher, as Henry says, requires dealing with the intermittency in new and surprising ways. I think market mechanisms that allow price signals to get down to consumers in effective ways. So people aren't all charging their cars in the evening when they drive home from work. So so you could actually create markets for load shifting devices, essentially various ways of doing thermal storage or other types of storage that allows you to change the time of use. I think market signals are really important for that. I would say also for large scale infrastructure, in China, they've been very successful at building big power lines and big hydroelectric dams because it's not that there's no political opposition, but it's much easier to overcome political opposition in a more centralized system. At the same time, there are many things that are inefficient in those systems. The curtailment of wind, for example, is how much power is wasted in China because of their central control is I think a nice example. So I think there's pros and cons, but ultimately this next phase of decarbonization, we argue electricity reform, not a perfect market like the US, but critical reforms on siting, on dispatch, on transmission decisions, are absolutely critical. They can't just continue to do it in a top-down, state-controlled way. I think that's pretty compelling. Henry?
Yeah, I agree. I think if you think of an investor who wants to consider the cost of fuel or the availability of fuel or 10 years from now, it's really important that they have a market signal that will help them make the right decision. If you don't have any market signals, there's really no guidance. You have to just think about what you think the state will do 10 years from now, or what will be required in, well, I guess it would be the 16th five-year plan. That's, as I said, is very inexact and very difficult. It's much easier if you have some sense of what the market will require. And then I think that the sort of options such as demand side management, which is going to become more important in a intermittent system. There's no incentive right now for demand side management in China. And that, I think, is going to have to change. So that I could give a whole list of technologies like this, but you need the ability to build the infrastructure, to build the transmission line, but you also need the signals for all of the provincial officials, local officials, and consumers to make the right decisions.
Okay. So we're getting a lot of questions on hard to abate sectors like the industrial sector. So I'm going to group a few of those. So how do you think, like, what are your views on electrifying the heavy industry sector in particular, and especially like green hydrogen being a part of the solution towards decarbonization of this sector? Do you think we're going to meet it in time, or is it something that the industrial sector we won't be able to decarbonize that in China?
So, you know, Priyank, you know, because you and I are working on this topic. The reason we call it a hard to decarbonize sector is because they're hard to decarbonize. They're hard. And I don't think China, I don't think China is going to find it dramatically easier to decarbonize those sectors than anywhere else. I will say that in some of those sectors, the US has a disadvantage, ironically. We're less carbon intensive because of our natural gas abundance. We have a lot of cheap natural gas. In Europe, they have natural gas, but it's expensive and geopolitically complicated because a lot of it comes from Russia. And China just doesn't have that much natural gas access. So they use coal in many of those sectors. They are difficult to decarbonize. Green hydrogen is one of the approaches that people have talked about. I'm a little skeptical, but would love to see Chinese manufacturing bring the cost of hydrogen electrolyzers down, but I still am skeptical about those costs. In the US, those costs are obscene because we have such cheap natural gas. In Europe and China, where they pay much, much more for natural gas, it's maybe a little more economical. So maybe we'll see it emerge there, but they're hard. I suspect that those sectors will depend more on decisions in trade policy and markets. For example, if the European Union decides to put tariffs based on effective carbon prices in some of those sectors, and the WTO steps in and allows it, I think that may be an important way for various countries, including China, who want to participate in the European market to produce green products of all sorts. I think we see the same thing in the US right now. For many industries that are trying to invest in new green technology, the way they make money is selling it at a premium in California, where there's actually a price on carbon. I think the same will be true in the international arena. Essentially, it's already true, but it'll be even more so in the future as we talk about trade adjustments. Henry?
Yeah, I would just add one thing, is that China has made a commitment in its latest 5-year plan to put an enormous amount of money into energy R&D and to develop the sources of the future. They're putting 7% increase in their R&D budget for energy every year for the next 5 years, and a 10.5% increase in basic science for each of the next 5 years. I think the United States needs to do the same, but I'm not that optimistic it will on a sustained basis. So China is making a real commitment to put a lot of money into developing the energy options of the future, which may include green hydrogen, and a lot of money into finding ways to produce steel or cement more efficiently and by fuels other than fossil fuels. So they are making a commitment, and it's quite impressive on paper, at least.
I also think there's something important to say about green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is kind of a buzz right now, and there's lots of reasons to be skeptical. I think it's also important to be humble. If you think back 15 years, not that long ago, sort of mid 2000s, sort of a little bit before Obama came to office. Natural gas was $12 to $15 per MMBTU in many parts of the US. Natural gas looked like its supply was running out in the US. We weren't predicting the shale gas boom. That changed everything. And similarly, I don't think anybody predicted how fast wind and solar were going to come down. And that's changed everything as well. So I think a little humility about the future is important. The great physicist Niels Bohr once said, prediction is difficult, especially the future. And I think there's a lot of wisdom there. We have to recognize that the changes we've seen in the last 15 years may easily happen again in the next 15 years. I think that the danger is in assuming they will happen. There are many technology advocates that just say, if we invest in this, it will happen. That is a bridge too far for me. I think we have to be a little bit thoughtful about how to create the kind of markets and prices that lead to the kind of innovation we want to occur and the learning curves that we hope to get.
We're getting a lot of questions, and given the time, I think we'll take this one question on, on geopolitics. So there's been some discussion that the war in Ukraine may lead to more rapid decarbonization in Europe because of the desire to reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas. Is there a possibility that this may also be the case in China, or does this assertion of a special relationship mean that we'll continue on a business as usual basis?
Well, I think you have to begin to look at the numbers, and that I think that the main concern in China right now has been over coal and coal supplies. And I think that the short-term response has been to try to get more coal. China has dramatically increased its purchase of coal from Indonesia, for example, in the last 6 months. It would buy it from Australia, but right now they're fighting with Australia, so they're not buying it from Australia. They have tried to to build more LNG stations to bring in more gas. They are looking at a number of options to increase supply. I think that there will also be a counter movement to move even faster towards renewables, which are a domestic fuel. To push nuclear to the extent it can. And I agree with Dan, it's going to be very difficult. So I think you'll have a surge in supply for the next year. And then I think they're going to kind of fall back and look at renewables and low carbon options. I think it will give momentum to the effort towards low carbon, but it will not in the short term. In the short term, they're going to look towards supply issues to meet the short-term problems that they're facing.
I agree with that. I've got to say, I do think there may be some upsides in Europe and China in terms of the war in Ukraine, making them worry even more about energy security. And as Henry says, increasing generation capacity is likely a short-term move. And that may accelerate the move. Ultimately, the US and China have to get to where Spain and Germany and Ireland are today. We have to get to 40%. And that's clearly doable. Although I will say those countries do it mostly with natural gas. Doing it without natural gas is going to be an interesting challenge for China. But I suspect they'll meet it. It's going to take some time to get to 40%. They're only at 10 or 11% right now. It's not going to happen overnight. But going deeper, it's really hard, and we'll see where that goes. I have another lesson though from the war of Ukraine, and I think it's unfortunate. I think we haven't yet really digested. And by the way, the situations are changing, and so I can't predict what's going to happen a month from now. I think it's possible that the world will emerge from what Russia is doing in the Ukraine today with a stronger sense of world order, with an empowered NATO and a stronger sense that at least most countries in the world want to cooperate. But it's also quite possible that the war in Ukraine dashes the hopes of global diplomacy and global cooperation that in some ways is the foundation for the concept of the Paris Agreement. Remember, there's no enforcement and part of Paris. And in the long run, will Paris be sufficient to go down the path of deep decarbonization? That's a big question. And there are big questions about whether what Russia is doing in Ukraine undermines the whole, what Joe Nye calls the world order. Big questions about whether or not it's a kind of exercise that we undertook in Paris, a global agreement based on voluntary commitments and aspirations. What does that mean when a country goes in and bombards civilians with artillery and tanks and airplanes? It's horrific. And I think this is going to be a continuing question that all of us are asking. How does the kind of global cooperation and global governance needed to deal with climate change, what does that even mean when we're back at World War II-like conflict between nations?
Well, we are out of time. As Dan and Henry, it's really been insightful to hear your thoughts on China's transition to a low carbon economy. Thanks very much. And please visit our website to sign up for future seminars in this seminar series. Thank you.